Welcome back to Old School Sports and our Out of the Park Baseball 24 playthrough of the Cincinnati Reds. And we are at the end of the 2024 regular season. Our Reds were 83 and 79, which was a 6-game improvement from a 77 win season our first year with the team in 2023. And our Reds are a playoff team here in 2024, despite being just a couple games over 500. We were 7-6 against the Brewers during the regular season, and that is what enabled us to win the tiebreaker over Milwaukee. And we will be facing the Atlanta Braves, the NL East champions, in a 3-game wildcard series in Atlanta starting in a couple of days. And as we get ready for that series to get underway, we've got a 3-man rotation that we're going to be set with. And our 3 top pitchers are going to be the ones who are going, at least our 3 top healthy starting pitchers to be more accurate. Zach Wheeler, who was 8-8 with a 3.31 ERA this year, picked him up in a trade in the offseason from Tampa Bay. Making a lot of money this year. He's going to be a free agent next year, but thought that he could help us potentially be a playoff team, and he certainly did do that. Nick Lodolo, who had a really great year for us, 16-4 with a 3.23 ERA, in NL Best 215 strikeouts, the potential Game 2 starter. And then Huascar Inoa, who we picked up in a trade with Atlanta at the start of this playthrough back in early 2023 when he was injured. His come up and really had a nice rookie year essentially for us this year, 14-11 with a 3.47 ERA. His BABIP of 267 was the best in the league, so certainly can argue that Inoa's gotten a bit lucky with his performance, but still had a nice year for us. We're going to be going with a 9-man bullpen for the playoff series. So that'll enable us to have 14 position players on the roster. Hopefully give manager David Bell some interesting options to consider. And we are going to actually make a bit of a weird move. Noelvi Marte, one of the better prospects in our system, spent the entire year in AAA, where he had a big year, 290, 37 home runs. And we are actually going to bring him up and have him make his major league debut for us in the playoffs. He's going to be the 14th man on the roster for us. Just think potentially his ability to play second, third, and short at a reasonably competent level gives us another right-handed bat off the bench. A little bit of power, at least certainly a lot of power in what he demonstrated down in AAA this year, and felt that he was the best option. We had that's a odd way to be speaking, but the potential 14th man in a perfect world would actually have ended up being Kike Hernandez, who we had signed to a minor league contract this year and then brought up on September 1st. And he actually played a pretty important role for us down the stretch with a lot of injuries. You can see he started 28 games for us. Wasn't particularly effective, hitting just 219, and was basically a replacement level player. But because he was on a minor league contract and we never put him on the 40-man roster until September 1st when we brought him up, he was not eligible for the playoff roster. So that will result in us bringing up Marte. But I think we can certainly argue that at this point in his career, Marte is probably going to be just as important to us and potentially better for us than Kike Hernandez was. And you may have noticed when we were back on this screen that manager David Bell actually wants Marte right in the lineup as a second baseman, starting second baseman against both righties and lefties. I can't really quibbled with that too much, even though he's never played in the majors. Oswaldo Cabrera was our second baseman for much of this year, and he hit just 211 with 4 homers and 317 at-bats. Similar players defensively. Cabrera's a little better error rating, but Marte a little bit better infield arm. And I think that, just looking purely at the batting ratings, even though Marte will be making his major league debut in the playoffs, can definitely argue that Marte's bat is a little bit better. So will be interesting to see how this goes. Could be a relatively quick playoff appearance for these Reds, but we're in the tournament, and you never know what can happen. And before we get to the playoffs, I'd gotten a comment on our last episode from Not My Four-Ply asking us to check in on our minor league system, which we hadn't done in a while, so wanted to do that quickly. You can see we're ranked 5th overall, so we still have a pretty solid minor league system. Ellie De La Cruz is our top prospect, ranked 14th in baseball. Brought him up in July of this year, and he was pretty productive for us. 304 average, 13 doubles and 7 homers, and 171 at-bats. Really had not too much left to prove at AAA. And certainly that batting profile is useful. He's playing right field for us right now, but certainly could end up moving to first base or third base more permanently next year when we give some thought in this offseason to who we want to bring back and who we want to move on from. Jorge Guerrero is a international amateur free agent signing of ours from just a few months ago. You may remember him. He is the guy who we think has a potentially incredibly interesting bat. And he also is a guy who could be a potentially interesting pitcher. Only 17 years old, so he's still at our international complex, but he's the number 29 prospect in baseball right now. Looking forward to possibly seeing what he can do in the DSL next summer. Sal Stewart, first base prospect, spent the full year in high A ball this year. He hit just .232 in high A ball last year in a limited sample size after he moved him up from A ball. Issue is he only got the batting average up to .234 this year, 19 doubles, 10 homers. You look at his potential according to our scout, and he still seems like a pretty good prospect. He's the number 51 prospect in baseball. He'll be 21 on December 7th, so even though he doesn't have a green arrow right now to be going up to AA, I think with the fact that he has spent a season and a half in high A ball now, and certainly his ratings that would suggest he can be a reasonably effective player at AA, that's probably where he will begin the season next year. Alfredo Duno, another guy who's at our international complex, almost 19 years old now. The catcher is the number 91 prospect in baseball. Could have brought him up to the DSL this year, but our DSL team has a fair number of catchers on it already, so figured we'd give him a little extra seasoning in the complex before bringing him into official professional baseball. Certainly looks like someone who could be above average defensively with a little bit of pop in his bat. So nice prospect there. Marte, we already talked about. He's going to be making his major league debut against the mighty Atlanta Braves in the playoffs. Braylon Miller, shortstop. You can see a pretty big drop-off here from the 116th prospect to the 176th prospect. 21-year-old shortstop, probably going to start focusing now on training him a little more to play some other positions. Doesn't look like he's going to have an incredible bat, but he does have a bat that if he fully develops, he's going to be a little bit above average in everything, and with acceptable speed, acceptable bunting skills, and the ability to play a lot of positions in the infield, could be a pretty useful utility infielder certainly for us. And I think with that bat, I don't love the glove at second base, and I don't love the glove at third base, but both of those are definitely options. He's also got the ability to be a left fielder, so an interesting player, not a premier prospect, but Minier still looks like someone who can hopefully help our team down the line. Check in on a couple of other players that we've picked in recent drafts. go through all of the top 200 prospects on our team. Bryce Hubbard, you may remember, guy that I thought he was up. Actually, I think I may have brought him up and then sent him right back down. So you probably wouldn't remember him since he pitched those 7 games in AAA for us. Was pretty respectable, 4-1 record, 3.89 ERA after a somewhat disappointing year in AA. When we were having the injury issues later in the season, there was one point where I had thought about bringing him up, but obviously I didn't actually do that. Certainly looks like he could be a useful major league arm, but he's a spot starter, maybe a 5th starter, long reliever out of the bullpen, but somebody who could help us down the line. Don't love the fact that he's got the below average movement. I think that that's not perfect for Great American Ballpark, but it is what it is. And then Austin Hendrick, another guy who's in AAA, also a guy who was promoted from AA to AAA by us in the middle of this season. Hit .311 with 29 homers in AAA, hit .297 with 29 homers in AA. So 58 homers and 137 ribbies for Austin Hendrick. Certainly think he looks like he's almost fully developed at this point. Corner outfielder, nice arm in right field with that 65 rating. Would think that he's got a good chance of being on the major league roster next season. I think there's certainly an argument that you'd like to have him on the playoff roster instead of Noel V. Marte, but that's not an option as he's not on our 40-man roster. So that's really why we went with Marte. I think all else being equal, could certainly argue that the bat of Hendrick would play even better potentially in a short series where someone who can hit a big home run and a pinch hit at bat could be a big bonus for us. That said, I think Marte is still an upgrade over Peraza at second base. So we will go with him and hopefully find out what Mr. Hendrick can do next year. A couple other guys, not going to go through everyone else at this point. Chase Petty, starting pitching prospect, moved him up from high A ball to double A, and he was 4-1 with a 132 average in double A. 21-year-old, probably will still have him start next year in double A, but would expect to see him in triple A before the end of the year. And could be a September call-up if everything goes well for him. Gavin Grayovac, you may remember we picked in the second round back in 2023, first year with the team. Hit .279 this year in a full season in rookie ball. Going to be turning 20 years old soon. A pretty versatile player. The bat doesn't look quite as enticing as maybe it did when he was being drafted, but still looks like he could be a useful major league player down the line. Bryce Eldridge is the player that we took 7th overall in the first round of that same draft. He's a two-way prospect. It's been brutal in rookie ball for 2 seasons for him as a pitcher. The batting, somewhat better. Hit .321 last year, just .235 this year. Did have 6 homers in 98 at-bats. Think his future is probably more likely as a power-hitting outfielder. But given that his pitching ratings look like he's got a chance at least, particularly if that changeup develops and he maybe finds a little bit better control. Still going to let him be a two-way player for probably the next season, and then we'll have to make a choice one way or another. Just a couple other guys. Jesus Conchola, who we picked up as an international free agent signing in February, had a brutal year as an 18-year-old in rookie ball, hitting just a .144 for our DSL team. And then the last guy we'll mention is Eric Batanti, who was our third-round pick back in 2023. We're pleasantly surprised when he fell to us. Hit 249 with 9 homers and 169 at-bats in rookie ball for us this year. He'll be a 19-year-old next year. We'll see whether perhaps he's ready to move up to A-ball or needs one final year in rookie ball before we start moving him up through the system. So for those of you who are interested in finding out more about some of the top prospects in our system and some of the players that we've drafted over these last couple years and or picked in international amateur free agency, or more accurately signed in international amateur free agency, I hope that update was useful. And before we get the playoff series started, just check in on one or two other things. Fan interest is a metric that I am not always thrilled with in OOTP, and this year I'd say is another good example. We had an 84, I believe it was somewhere in the mid-80s in terms of our fan interest at the beginning of the season, selling out pretty frequently, and this was a team that was a 60-win team a couple years ago that improved to 77 wins this year with a ton of really exciting top prospects and talent that we ended up bringing on board throughout the season. We were in the playoff race the entire year after a great start, finished with a winning record, finished in the playoffs, as I've talked about. And despite all that, our fan interest contracted by over 10 points during the season, which I think is a little bit unrealistic. So when the programmers at OOTP start investing a little more into the GM and the finances and the franchise mode of the game rather than the perfect team aspects of the game or the 3D aspects of the game that seem to have been receiving a little more attention over the past few years, hopefully the fan interest dynamic will be something that they spend a little time working on, because it is critical in terms of driving attendance and driving your finances. And we did okay. I mean, almost 3 million people in the park this year, 11th in attendance. Our revenue per game up 36%, attendance per game up over 40%. And even in terms of our owner goals, although it's a very important goal of ours for 2026 to increase fan interest, so we're not doing well on that front. We certainly did not suck completely making the playoffs, and we've also, perhaps reached goals early in terms of acquiring an all-star and increasing attendance significantly. So still a pretty successful year in terms of our goals with ownership, and now we will see whether we can upset the mighty Atlanta Braves here in the 2024 wildcard series in the National League. And certainly on paper, our Reds are big underdogs. The Braves, as we mentioned, were the NL East winners, 88-win team. They were 4-2 against us this year. They were 4th in the National League in runs scored, while we were 6th. They were tied for second in the National League in runs against, while we were tied for 9th. And all 3 potential games in this series will be played in Atlanta. So certainly they are the favorites. We've got Zach Wheeler, who is our ace at this point, with Aaron Nola out for the year with that injury. Going up against Spencer Strider, big-time pitcher for the Braves. Looks like he probably had some injury issues this year, pitched just 21 games. An oblique strain that kept him out for 6 weeks, so basically missed all of June and part of July with that. He also had a sore elbow in April, so got off to kind of a slow start this year in terms of injuries, but he's been healthy over the last half of the year. It looks 10-2 record with a 2.48 ERA, 183 batting average against, so certainly a difficult matchup, even though we've got Wheeler on the mound for the Reds here in Game 1 of this wild card series. And perhaps not shockingly, the Braves beat us 5-3. Strider with the W, Wheeler with the L. TJ Friedel hit a homer for us. Taking a look at the box score, We did get 2 in the second. They bounced right back with 4. We clawed back with a third run in the third inning to get within 1. And we were 1 run away throughout the game. They added on an insurance run in the 8th and then shut us down in the 9th. Strider, 2 hits, 3 walks, 12 strikeouts over 7 innings, did allow those 3 earned runs. Wheeler with 5 hits and a walk over 5 2/3, but 4 earned runs. So a little surprising that he gave up so many runs, not allowing a home run. But Diaz did allow a home run in relief. Spencer Strider with the Atlanta Braves playoff game record for strikeouts with 12. A little surprised by that. I would have thought with that incredible pitching staff that the Braves had throughout the 90s and into the early 2000s that somebody over the years would have recorded more than 12 strikeouts in a game. So you learn something new every day if you play OOTP. So we've lost game 1, on to game 2, when we are going to have Nick Lodolo on the mound against Max Fried. I think these are probably the 2 guys who are going to finish first and second in the NL Cy Young Award voting this year. Lodolo on our team, as we've talked about, 16-4, led the league with 215 strikeouts per 9 innings. But Fried, even a better year perhaps, 18-3 record, led the league in ERA, WHIP, walks per 9, strikeout to walk ratio, FIP minus, and WAR at 4.6. As I said, I think these guys will finish 1-2 in the Cy Young Award voting in the NL this year. I think that Fried will win the award over Lodolo, but hopefully Lodolo can get a small measure of preemptive revenge for missing out on the Cy Young Award by maybe getting us a surprising win today and pushing this to a third and deciding game in Atlanta. And we've got a chance. Lodolo did get the W, Fried with the loss, Clay Holmes on for the save, Nick Ahmed, Jared Kelenic, and Ellie De La Cruz, all with home runs. They got a bunch of home runs off of us too. So a lot of offense in this game. Got off to a nice start with a couple runs in the first and second, 1 in the third, 3 in the fourth, 1 in the fifth. So we scored early and often against Atlanta. Kelenic, who has been dealing with that strained triceps, which has a moderate impact on his throwing. We've forced him into the DH role so he doesn't have to throw, but still obviously wanted that bat in the lineup. I think he will be getting some MVP votes for us this year. He ended up 2 for 4 with those 4 RBIs today. We already talked about all the home runs from Kelenic, Ahmed, and Ellie De La Cruz. Lodolo, 3 hits and 3 walks with 7 strikeouts over 5 2/3. Ian Anderson, ugly performance in relief. 4 hits, 4 earned runs over an inning, including 3 home runs allowed. So not a good performance by our former closer, Ian Anderson. Makes me feel even better that we did make that trade near the trade deadline to bring on Clay Holmes, who has definitely stabilized that closer role for us this year, and hopefully will stabilize it for us for several years to come. So we are at least putting up a respectable battle here in the playoffs. Deciding Game 3 of this wildcard series, Huascar Ynoa, 14-11, 3.47 ERA on the mound for us. Kyle Wright for the Braves was 10-11 this year with a 4.49 ERA. The veteran 20-game winner a couple years ago. So he's gotten somewhat steadily less effective over the last couple of years. His WAR has gone from 3 to 2.9 to 1 this season. Certainly would think that a battle-tested, championship-proven team like the Braves at home in a potential third deciding game would be the favorite. But with Ynoa on the mound, we've definitely got a puncher's chance. Not to be the case, though. Wright outpitched Ynoa Got a couple homers from Matt Olson, another one from Vaughn Griffin. Olson with homer in every game of the series, one in the first, one in the second, and two here in game 3. Obviously results in him being named MVP. Braves scored in both the first and second, added 3 more in the fifth, 2 in the seventh to get their 7 runs. We did get a couple in the eighth, but we were never really a strong contender in this one. Inoa looks like he might have gotten hurt. Ejected in the first inning for igniting a bench-clearing brawl. So that's disappointing to just get 2/3 of an inning pitched and 11 pitches out of Inoa. The lefty Brett Martin came on, followed by Diaz, Brule, Anderson, who had another brutal outing. An inning and a third with 3 hits, 3 earned runs, and 2 more home runs. So in 2 1/3 playoff innings, Ian Anderson has given up 7 earned runs and 5 homers. Definitely not the most impressive playoff debut I've ever seen. Rever San Martin also gave up a run, and Tyler Wells gave up a run as well. So the relief was not good, was not an optimal outcome to lose our starter in the the bottom of the first inning. We knew we were going to be up against it with the Braves being our opponent, but it's good to have these Reds getting a little playoff experience this season. Hopefully, and this is the big hope for the offseason, that Aaron Nola will come off of that elbow ligament reconstruction surgery almost as good as he was beforehand. I am worried that it is a 31-year-old. His injury proneness after a major injury like that may turn to fragile, which will not be a perfect situation for us, given that we've got him for at least another 5 years and then possibly a 6th year through his early and mid-30s. But if he can come back healthy next year, we've got young talent on the team. We'll check in and see what Marte actually did in the playoffs. I'm sure some of you probably noticed that in the box scores. I did not. He was 2 for 11, a couple of singles, walked a couple of times. So it wasn't great, but it wasn't a total disaster either. So we've got a lot of good young talent. We will be likely losing Wheeler, who's going to be a free agent, but we will get Nola back. So hopefully net. Again, if Nola is healthy, that's going to be decent for our pitching staff. And then it's just a matter of where our budget goes and how much money we've potentially got to spend. We are in a situation where some of our players are going to start making bigger money next year. Stevenson looking at around $8 million. Nick Lodolo looking at over $7 million next year. Inoa even going to be up to 2.5, and then a few other guys who are coming off of their potential minimum contracts. Clay Holmes is going to be making some significant money the next 3 years, but obviously Nola is the critical one. If he is able to be a good solid, or a better than a good solid major league pitcher, if he is a good major league starter, a guy who could be a number 2 or 3 on just about any team, and we can get that performance from him for the next few years. Coming off of the major injury he's coming off of, I'd view that as a victory. Obviously, we brought him on board with this contract to be our ace, and he will almost certainly be our number 1 guy next year if he is healthy and well. But being realistic about it, if he's a good, productive starter and healthy for the next several years, that may be about the best that we can hope for coming off of elbow ligament reconstruction surgery in his mid-30s. Or in his early 30s. And we'll take a look at the players that we had on our team this year who helped the Reds into the playoffs. We've already spent a lot of time talking about the pitching staff. Wheeler's going to be a free agent. I think he's been looking for pretty good money when we've talked to him. Yeah, over $20 million a year for 5 years. given that he's in his mid-30s, that may be an aggressive contract for us to consider. So probably we'll let him hit free agency. Lodolo will be back. 2 really good years in a row. I don't love his lack of movement. I think that could be really dangerous here in Great American Ballpark. He did give up almost 3 times as many homers this year as he did a year ago. So a bit of a reversion towards expectations after that incredible 2023 when he only allowed 9 homers in 179.1 innings pitched. But he's certainly proving to be a pretty effective major league starter. Same thing for Inoa. Tyler Wells should also, I believe, be back with us next year. Yep, he's in his arbitration years. And then right now, Rever San Martin is slotted in at least by David Bell as our number 5 starter. You can see he only started 1 game for us this year, but was very effective out of the pen with that 2.39 ERA. Clay Holmes will be back as our closer. Will Warren, who split the year between AAA and the majors, could stick with the big roster all year next year. Diego Castillo, going to be a free agent, so we're going to need to make a decision on him. Had a pretty solid year for us, 3.74 ERA, 79 and a third innings pitched. Ian Anderson, probably going to end up being a middle reliever for us. He was our closer before we picked up Holmes. We also tried him in the rotation a bit this year where he was pretty brutal. Ended up 8-8, 20 saves, 4.64 ERA. Brett Martin kind of did a decent job for us as a lefty reliever. Alexis Diaz, nice job as a righty reliever. And then Justin Brule, who we picked up in the Rule 5 draft. The numbers aren't incredible. 2-4 with a 4.40 ERA. But we picked him up to handle left-handed pitching, or left-handed batting, and he did have a 3.38 ERA and a 2.13 batting average against when he was facing lefties. So he pretty much did the job that we expected and think he could certainly be an important player for us next year. Thinking about some other pitchers, obviously Nola returning healthy is critical. Fernando Cruz has had a couple nice years for us out of the bullpen. Hope he'll be back. Vladimir Gutierrez spent some time in AAA for us this year, has had a lot of injuries, may not be a big part of the team next year. And then when we think about the playoff roster, there's a few other pitchers that we haven't even talked about yet. Graham Ashcraft, 6.07 ERA for us in the majors this year. I think the hope would be that he doesn't end up being on our 26-man roster next year. Hunter Green came back from an injury this year, 2-5 with a 7.64 ERA, so his future is definitely in doubt. Joel Kuhnel, a guy who was up with us in 2023, spent the whole year in AAA this year. Connor Phillips is a younger guy, 23 years old, was not effective in a cup of coffee in September, but he could be a reliever for us down the line. Big issue with him is just his control, and is he going to walk too many people? And then Clark Schmidt didn't make the playoff roster. He was our 5th starter for much of the year, but a 5.65 ERA over 106 and 2/3 innings pitched. Going to be making a pretty decent, close to $2.5 million likely in arbitration next year. So unsure whether he will be back or not, but certainly with the likes of Nola and Clark Schmidt, as well as Will Warren and even Ian Anderson, there are options to fill in some of the 4th and 5th kind of starter roles on this team, assuming that Nola's healthy, Lodolo, Inoa are locked in at 1, 2, 3. Quite honestly, Wells is probably pretty locked in at number 4 at this point, but we do have prospects to be a 5th starter for us next year. Certainly it's conceivable that Hunter Green is still in the mix. He's still pretty young, and depending on how much money we've got to play with, we could try to bring in a more established starting pitcher as well, either through free agency or the trade market. So the pitching staff this year was pretty solid, and particularly as I've been talking about, if Nola is back and Nola is healthy next year, I think it's got an opportunity to take a step forward. And I think there's definitely potential for our everyday players to take a step forward next year, too, because we've got a lot of youth on the team. Tyler Stevenson is going to be making some bigger money next year as our starting catcher. He's well into his arbitration years at this point, and the number, as we talked about, around $8.5 million next year. Hit .258 with 20 home runs for us this year, a bit above average defensively. Likely will be back. Kurt Casale hit just .202 in 114 at-bats after we brought him back as our backup. It's conceivable we look for somebody different for that role next year. He's going to be 36 before the season starts. Love the personality. Love a lot of his personality traits. But he's looking for $2 million a year. I think we can probably find people who are .202 hitters, who are pretty average defensively, willing to be our backup catcher for less than $2 million a year. Ryan Mountcastle, we picked him up in a trade with Boston last year. Hit .294 with 12 homers and 293 at-bats. Potentially important bat for us next year. We talked about how Cabrera was a bit disappointing. His starting second baseman role is definitely in jeopardy, with Marte likely to be on the roster next year. Christian Encarnacion, a guy who we struggled to get consistent playing time this year. He did end up still starting 94 games for us. .253 average, 18 homers, and 371 at-bats. Can play first or third for us. We've got a lot of guys who fit the bill as being first baseman / third baseman. Would certainly think that he'll be on the 26-man roster next year. Might be someone who we look to get a little playing time in the outfield. He could be a competent... I don't want to say competent. He could be a not horrible defensively left or right fielder for us. So that's something maybe we work on in spring training to potentially be able to get him into the lineup a little more often. Matt McLean came up, hit .244 with 14 homers and 303 at-bats. Very versatile player. He certainly has a role at the age of 25 on the team next year. Spencer Steer, starting third baseman much of the year, 26 years old, .224 average with 17 homers. Another guy who's pretty versatile defensively, can play a lot of different positions for us. Nick Ahmed, we signed him as a free agent late when he was on the market in February. Loved the glove, and he hit .270 for us with 37 doubles. If he's able to have an OPS plus and a WRC plus anywhere over 100, which is where he was this year, he's going to be a pretty valuable player. You can see he put up a 4.2 WAR for us this year, which I think was second on the team behind only Kelnick. Wilyer Abreu, picked him in the Rule 5 draft from Boston, hit .248 with 27 doubles, 11 homers, and 436 at-bats. Certainly has a profile of a useful corner outfielder / DH for us in the coming years. Jared Kelnick, who we picked up very early in this playthrough, April of 2023, picked him up in a trade with Seattle when they had him in AAA and weren't really sure whether he was going to be a big-time prospect for them. He spent most of last year in Louisville for us, where he developed better than we thought he possibly could when we had picked him up. And then, as I mentioned, he's going to get some MVP votes this year after hitting .286, 37 doubles, 38 homers, OPS of close to 900, 5.8 WAR, which was best on the team. Will be nice when we can get him back into the outfield next year, but certainly an important player for us. TJ Friedel, center fielder, hit .233, 14 homers, stole 13 bases, 2.2 WAR on the year. He's more than acceptable defensively out there with his 65 range and error ratings. Would love it if the bat was a little better. It's a position we could upgrade, but it's also a position we don't feel horrible about with Friedel out there. Will Benson, another young outfielder, .244 average with 18 homers and 311 at-bats this year. Pretty versatile, can play right, center, left field, also first base. We've got a lot of good young guys who can play first base, third base, left field, right field, DH. Just going to be a matter of figuring out which ones we want to have on the 26-man roster next year and who we can potentially think about trading away in this offseason to maybe bring on some talent as a catcher or starting pitcher. Again, for the bullpen, we could always use some help. Last but not least, Elly De La Cruz, top prospect in our system. Another guy can play first, third, right field. I'm not going to claim he can play short, even though that's where he kind of came up through the minors. Hit .264 with 25 homers in AAA this year. Brought him up in July, and as we talked about, .304, 7 home runs, 136 OPS plus, 139 WRC plus. He should be a big part of the Reds for many years to come. And the nice thing about this Reds team, which, as we've talked about, improved by 6 games this year to 83 wins in a playoff team, is that we can have just about everybody that we talked about back if we'd like. Wheeler, as we talked about, is a free agent. That's the potential big loss, but have to see what Nola looks like. And we should hopefully have a better sense of what Nola is when he recovers from that injury in 5 weeks. We can hopefully scout him before free agency starts, and also see what the potential free agent options at starting pitcher look like. Wheeler could certainly help us. I don't know that it's going to be a prudent move or even a possible move for a team like Cincinnati to offer him $20-ish million a year for 5 years when we're already on the hook for a similar amount with Nola. Casali, as we've talked about, is a free agent. Diego Castillo, who we picked up in that trade with the Dodgers, is a free agent. And then other than that, it's just Austin Hedges and Kike Hernandez, who we signed as minor league free agents this year. Otherwise, we've got options to have just about everybody back, and 2025 could be the year that we really have to make a run for it, because you can see our salary obligations with some of these young players starting to get in their arbitration years are going to get pretty excessive potentially in 2026 and 2027. So unless we get a huge bump in our team budget over the next couple of years, we're going to have some real decisions to make about who we want to keep and who we want to move on from when some of this young talent starts making some real money. So going to be interesting decisions for us over the next few years, and certainly a lot of interesting decisions coming up in the upcoming offseason. And as we wait to find out who the World Series champion is and what our potential budget's going to look like next year, we do have the first potential training camp for international amateur free agents coming up. Certainly an interesting crop of prospects this year. You can see we don't have a good sense of any of these players at this point. We certainly will request a scouting report on all of them to start increasing our knowledge of these big-time potential young players who could help us down the line. We'll figure out which 10 we want to bring into the initial camp, and I'm sure we'll spend more time on this in the subsequent episodes. Not going to go incredibly deep on my decision-making process with these guys here in October. Generally, I'm going to bring in all of the guys that our scout thinks are the top prospects initially. So I can guarantee we're going to be bringing in the 6 guys who we think are over 3-star potential as far as the batters. As far as the pitchers, we'll probably bring in the 2 guys who we think are 3-star potential or better. And then I'll spend a little time thinking about who I want besides all of those players for the other 2 spots in the camp. But basically just want to learn as much as possible about the potentially top players in these very early rounds of scouting. And one piece of good news for the Reds this year, we can spend up to $5,700,000. So coming off of a relatively poor performance a year ago, we're not one of the teams that's limited for 4.75 million, which is where most of the teams land out. We can spend also almost $1 million more than most of the other teams in baseball. So hopefully that will be a bit of an advantage for us. And we've got 10 players that we invited into this camp. The 6 top-rated batting prospects, as we talked about, the 2 top-rated pitching prospects, and then a couple other pitching prospects that we thought looked potentially interesting. So we'll run the practice. Hopefully we can start building some relationships and, just as importantly, some better scouting accuracy with these young prospects. And a little bit of progress. You can see we've got some average and strong relationships now. Scouting accuracy still not generally great. Strong relationship we have is with the young catcher David Espinoza. Certainly looks like a potentially interesting bat with plus contact and well above average home run power if he fully develops. Only looks like he's going to be average defensively, which is not optimal, to use my catchphrase. But obviously, we've got a long road ahead of us over the next 3+ months until we have to really start making any decisions on who we're going to bring on board. And hopefully, by the time we get to that point, we're going to have stronger relationships with a lot more players and a lot more accurate scouting information on all of these prospects as well. And even though it's just an imaginary virtual world, as a Yankees fan, it always hurts a little bit to see the Boston Red Sox end up as the World Series champions, beating the Dodgers 4-1. A very strong playoff run for the Red Sox. They swept the Astros 1-6 against the Guardians, and then took out the Dodgers in 5 games. Sure that if they're watching either Patrick DeBonis or Around the World Sports or some of our other Boston fans who are fans of this series, are enjoying the virtual victory for the Red Sox here in 2024. And with the season in the books, the off season is underway. We've been doing a lot of scouting of those international amateur free agents, as I've talked about, also re-scouting our 40-man roster. But now it's time to kind of see where the rubber meets the road. We've got an option year decision on Brett Martin, $1.4 million. 3-7 record with a 3.76 ERA, was a pretty effective lefty for us out of the pen. Tend to think we'll probably be picking that up. Robert Castellini, happy with the work we did get into the playoffs. Happy we brought Aaron Nola on board. Pleased with our attendance. Thinks we're on our way for our profit goals. Not pleased with fan interest. Very happy we completed the challenge of, I believe that was the team record in acquiring a player. Very happy with our performance. Still good with our performance, but wants to see more from the team. Wants us to reach the playoffs. Wants us to acquire an MVP. Final total balance of $21 million, increased fan interest, better record in road games, and reach the World Series in the next 5 seasons. So I hope he's given us some more money to do it. Not going to be the easiest thing in the world to acquire an MVP. And no change to our budget. We're still at $170 million. So it's going to be interesting. It looks like we're also losing a staff member. Assistant GM Nick Kroll. Oh, okay, that's fine. So he was demoted when we came on board, so that's fine. You can see we are losing some players in the minor leagues. So we're going to have to make a decision on Brett Martin. And then we're also going to have to make some decisions as to what our scouting and player development budgets are going to look like, because right now we don't have a ton of money available for next year, about $14 million to spend at this point. So we aren't destitute. and with a number of arbitration eligible players. Hopefully, we can save a little bit of money compared to what they're expecting to make. Hopefully, also signing some of those players will give us a boost to fan interest. We're going to have a decision as to whether we want to submit a QO to Zach Wheeler. Looking for $22.5 million a year for 5 years. Obviously, I've got time until we get to free agency to really think about this and see how things come out in terms of our arbitration eligible players, see who we think is really going to be a free agent as we get closer to free agency. But my initial reaction is to throw the QO out to him. I don't think he's going to accept it, but I know we don't want to sign him at about $22.5 million a year for 5 years. Depending on who's available in free agency, bringing him back for around $19 million for 1 year, particularly if Nola ends up healthy, could be pretty big for our pitching staff. Obviously, a lot can change over the next several weeks, looking at the upcoming free agents and the potential starting pitchers who are out there. There are some guys, Luis Severino, Corbin Burns, who we had thought about trading for, Shane Bieber, coming off of a torn rotator cuff, out for another 8 months. No thank you. Jose Quintana, 4 to 5 months off of ulnar nerve entrapment. With those guys both looking for around $20 million a year, probably not going to work. But Wheeler, potentially Severino, and Corbin Burns, there's definitely high-ish end options out there. Certainly you would think that somebody like Corbin Burns is a very high-end option. He would be our number one starter over Nola without a doubt, but doesn't have a completely dominant pitching profile here in OOTP, although he is coming off of a 20-win season with 270 strikeouts, so certainly not going to criticize him. He'd be a huge upgrade. Don't know if we can afford to be bringing him on board for over $30 million a year. Certainly, unless we make a lot of other changes, simple math will tell us that that's probably not realistic. But as I mentioned, we're going to have a lot of time to work through arbitration over the next several weeks. Free agency does not begin until November 30th, so we have over 3 weeks to figure out who's really going to be a free agent when all is said and done, and then make some decisions on whether or not we want to maintain that QO to Zach Wheeler or not. So it's going to be an exciting offseason for the Reds. Ownership is now, after just not wanting us to suck this past season, now they want us to reach the playoffs. So definitely some interesting goals for us going forward. We can at least negotiate potentially this acquiring an MVP. I don't love that goal. Ooh, that's interesting. We could extend Zach Wheeler instead. Something for us to think about. I don't really know that I love the option to, I don't know that I love extending Zach Wheeler. I don't know that I mind bringing him back for 1 year, but signing him to a long-term contract extension or a longer-term contract extension may not be the right move. So a lot of decisions for the Cincinnati Reds organization to make, and we're going to start trying to tackle them in our next episode. If you've got thoughts on what we should be doing based on the review of the players on our team that we went through, based on the contract situation, based on anything else that you've thought about, would love to hear them in the comments down below. And until our next episode, thank you so much for watching, and hope you have a great day.